On the morning of November 16th, the world felt unusually still, as if time itself was pausing to inhale. The sky looked ordinary, the roads looked ordinary, and the day began with the same familiar rhythm, yet there was a quiet pressure in the air, a subtle heaviness that only someone who was paying close attention could feel. It wasn't the heaviness of fear, it was the heaviness of possibility. Something wanted to be spoken, something wanted to be heard, and something wanted to be understood. It was the kind of moment where the universe leans in close and whispers, not because it wants to frighten you but because it wants to wake you. That was the day the message arrived, unexpected, uninvited, and impossibly intense. It didn't come with thunder, lightning, or any dramatic sign. It came quietly, yet the force of it shook something deep within. Today, November 16th, it said, God says, I will never talk to you if you skip me now. A big tragedy is coming your way. I am trying to save your life. You will receive into your open immediately. The words didn't feel like a warning in the traditional sense, they felt like a crossroads, a threshold where a decision carried weight far beyond the moment. But the human heart does not always know what to do when something larger than life speaks to it. Sometimes it trembles, sometimes it resists, and sometimes it pretends not to hear at all. And yet, the message was not there to scare, it was there to awaken. It was not about punishment, it was about preparation. It was not a threat, it was a reminder of the delicate threads that hold a life together, threads that sometimes require attention before they snap. As the message echoed in the mind, the first reaction was disbelief. The second was curiosity. The third was a strange, uncomfortable awareness that sometimes life sends signs disguised as coincidences. Sometimes life sends truth wrapped inside mystery. Sometimes, the universe uses intensity not to harm but to shake a person awake. And that was the beginning of the shift. All through the day, the words lingered like an invisible companion. While walking, while sitting, while thinking, while breathing, the message pulsed in the background like a steady heartbeat. What does it mean? Why today? Why now? What tragedy? What salvation? The questions were endless, yet the answers remained misty, half-formed, incomplete. But something inside whispered, stay open. Don't ignore. Don't look away. Life is speaking. The strange thing about warnings, real or imagined, is that they make a person notice things they usually overlook. That day, everything seemed sharp, detailed, almost luminous. The sound of footsteps echoed louder. The rustling of trees felt deliberate. Every conversation had a hidden layer, every glance carried meaning. And every silence held fullness. It was as if the world was trying to guide each motion gently, subtly, lovingly. Sometimes, we think divine messages must arrive wrapped in holiness, glowing with certainty, or delivered by miraculous signs. But what if the divine speaks in the language that resonates with the human condition, urgency, emotion, rawness? What if the message is shaped not to intimidate but to reach? What if the intensity is the only way to pierce through distraction, noise, doubt, routine? That day, the sense of being watched, not by someone dangerous, but by something protective, grew stronger. Not watched in surveillance, but watched in concern. Like a parent watching a child wander too close to the edge. Hoping, pleading silently that the child will turn around before slipping. The universe, or God, or whatever name one gives to that vast presence, often warns not with fear but with longing, longing for you to choose life, to choose awareness, to choose yourself. Every moment after the message felt different. Even the mundane carried hints of destiny. The coffee cup heated the hands in a strangely grounding way, as if reminding, you're alive, you're here, you're needed. The passing stranger's smile felt like a nod of reassurance. The sudden wind felt like a push in the back. And somewhere between footsteps and breaths, a realization surfaced. Perhaps the tragedy wasn't something external at all. Perhaps it was something internal, something quietly growing, something waiting for acknowledgement before becoming overwhelming. Tragedies don't always come as accidents or disasters. Sometimes they come as missed opportunities, ignored signs, emotional collapses, or broken connections. Sometimes the biggest tragedy is not what happens to you but what dies inside you when you refuse to listen to the deeper call. What if the message was a call to stop losing yourself? What if the tragedy was the loss of purpose, the decay of passion, the slow fading of your inner voice? Suddenly, the message felt less like a threat and more like a plea. It was as if God, or fate, was saying, don't abandon yourself. Don't neglect your path. Don't delay the choice that could save your future. Sometimes, the divine uses dramatic words not to frighten you but because soft whispers no longer reach you. And sometimes, when you are on the edge of a major shift, life speaks louder. The day unfolded slowly, filled with reflections that never would have surfaced without the message. Memories resurfaced, some painful, some comforting, some forgotten. Moments of regret passed through like shadows. Moments of hope rose like morning light. And through every memory and thought, the message kept weaving, don't skip this. Don't turn away. I am trying to save your life. By afternoon, the internal conversation grew deeper. What does it mean to be saved? Saved from what? Saved for what? Life-saving is rarely about miracles, it's often about moments. Moments where the right choice prevents the wrong outcome, moments where awareness prevents harm, moments where inner alignment prevents chaos. The tragedy could have been anything. A relationship falling apart irreversibly, a mistake made in haste, an emotional breakdown, a lost opportunity, a suppressed calling, and so, the mind journeyed inward. The message was not a prophecy. It was a mirror. It reflected fears, desires, suppressed truths, forgotten dreams, and unhealed wounds. It asked questions that were too often avoided. Are you living honestly? Are you listening to your inner voice? Are you ignoring what you know you must face? Are you sacrificing your future for temporary comfort? As the day drifted, the message transformed from being external to internal. The voice no longer sounded distant, divine, or separate. It sounded familiar, like something that lived deep within the heart, waiting for permission to speak. Maybe God wasn't a voice outside, maybe God was a voice inside, amplified by urgency. Maybe the tragedy looming wasn't fate, it was the cost of continued denial. By evening, the internal landscape had begun to shift. The mind was quieter, more centered. The heart was more open. The message no longer felt threatening or overwhelming. It felt like guidance, stern but loving, urgent but meaningful. It felt like a turning point. It felt like the moment before transformation. The moment where fate pauses, waiting for your choice before unfolding. A person's life rarely changes because of comfort. It changes because something shakes them awake. It changes because something confronts them. It changes because something demands attention. And sometimes, that demand comes in the form of a message that feels too sharp, too intense, too heavy to ignore. The night did not arrive suddenly, it approached like a patient visitor, slowly dimming the edges of the world. Streetlights flickered awake, casting long shadows that stretched like quiet reminders of the day's journey. The message still pulsed like a distant echo, not as loud as before, but persistent, like a heartbeat beneath every thought. Don't skip me. Don't ignore this moment. It wasn't commanding, it was asking. It wasn't angry, it was pleading. As darkness wrapped around the world, the mind drifted into old memories, memories buried carefully over the years, the kind that only surface when something deep inside calls them. Childhood fears resurfaced first, the fear of losing someone, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of not being good enough. Then came the teenage uncertainties, choices not made, opportunities missed, promises broken unintentionally. And then came the adult regrets, the ones soaked with the quiet pain of knowing better but acting too late. Each memory felt like a piece of a puzzle suddenly becoming relevant. Maybe the tragedy the message hinted at was connected to these unresolved moments. Maybe the danger wasn't something external waiting to strike, it was the internal weight a person carries silently until it becomes unbearable. And maybe the divine warning was not about calamity but about healing. Healing that had been postponed for too long. As the wind brushed against the windows, the heart felt a kind of ache that wasn't sadness but recognition. There are moments when life reveals what you've been suppressing, and those moments are often disguised as warnings. Not because something terrible is guaranteed to happen, but because something important is at risk of being lost if attention is not given. For the first time, the thought surfaced, what if the tragedy is the loss of myself? What if the message is trying to pull me back before I drift too far? That realization sparked a shift. Suddenly, the message wasn't an external force at all. It was the inner voice that had been neglected for years, the voice of intuition, the voice of truth, the voice that protects even when unacknowledged. People often call it conscience, others call it God, some call it instinct. But whatever the name, it is the voice that speaks when life is quietly steering you away from danger of wrong decisions, wrong people, wrong paths, wrong beliefs about yourself. The night deepened, and the room grew quieter. The world outside slowed. And in that stillness, another realization arose. Every person gets warnings, but most ignore them. Not because they are careless, but because they are overwhelmed. Not because they don't care, but because life distracts them. And sometimes, something drastic must shake them awake before they lose something precious: health, relationships, opportunities, peace, or even the sense of who they are. The message began to feel like a lifeline tossed across the stormy sea of uncertainty. It carried urgency, yes, but mixed with a deep sense of care. It wasn't saying, "Fear what's coming." It was saying, "Prepare for what you've been avoiding." It wasn't saying, "Something terrible will happen." It was saying, "You have reached the moment where choices matter." There is always a moment in a person's life where everything stands on a delicate balance. One wrong decision can create a ripple of consequences. And one right decision can shift the entire path into clarity. That moment often arrives quietly, and if unrecognized, it passes unnoticed. But on this day, the message made the moment visible. It was the kind of moment where the universe pauses, waiting for you to choose courage instead of fear, awareness instead of avoidance, growth instead of stagnation. And the tragedy, perhaps, was not in external events but in losing your potential by refusing to acknowledge your own calling. The internal dialogue grew deeper, almost like a conversation between two versions of the self, the one that struggles and the one that sees clearly. One said, "You're worrying too much." The other said, "You know this matters." One said, "It's just a message." The other whispered, "No, it's a reminder." And that whisper held power. Real power. The kind of power that shifts something in the soul, even if just by a fraction. Because sometimes, a fraction is all it takes to redirect an entire life. The night breeze found its way through the small gaps in the window, carrying a faint coolness that brushed against the skin like reassurance. The air felt different, lighter, calmer, as if something unseen approved of the growing awareness. In that moment, it became clear that divine guidance is not always wrapped in softness. Sometimes it comes wrapped in sharpness because comfort no longer awakens you. And sometimes, fear is not meant to frighten, it's meant to focus. The message kept echoing, but now it felt like a bridge, not a threat, not a command, but a bridge from who you have been to who you could become. A bridge from numbness to awareness, from confusion to clarity, from self-doubt to self-recognition. Life has a way of repeating lessons until they are learned. And perhaps the tragedy the message warned of was simply the cost of ignoring the same lesson again. The cost of running from truth. The cost of silence. The cost of delay. People often wait for big signs to trust themselves, but the reality is that every small discomfort, every quiet whisper, every strange coincidence, every sudden feeling of urgency, they are all signs. Signs pointing toward a choice that needs to be made. Signs pointing toward change. As midnight approached, something softened inside. The fear dissolved, replaced by a new sense of responsibility, to oneself, to one's journey, to one's future. The message was no longer something external demanding attention. It was an inner compass realigning, recalibrating. And with that shift came a quiet understanding: the divine never threatens. The divine warns with love. The divine does not punish for ignoring, it aches. It aches when you drift away from what makes you whole. It aches when you lose yourself in noise. It aches when you choose paths that wound you. And sometimes, that ache manifests as a message that feels urgent, but beneath the urgency is love. Always love. The night continued, and the story of the day wasn't ending, it was unfolding into something even deeper. As hours slipped quietly across the darkness, a strange calm settled inside, the kind of calm that comes only after a long inner storm. It wasn't peace in the usual sense, it was more like the stillness that arrives when the heart finally decides to stop running from itself. The message no longer felt like an intrusion, it felt like an anchor, something that had arrived not to disrupt but to stabilize. In that midnight silence, thoughts became clearer. The human mind rarely finds clarity in noise. It finds it in the quiet moments when the world steps back and allows the soul to speak. And in that deep stillness, something unexpected surfaced: gratitude. Gratitude for the message, gratitude for the uneasiness it caused, gratitude for the hidden truths it revealed. Because sometimes discomfort is a blessing disguised in rough edges, the mind wandered into possibilities. What if life had been on the verge of drifting into a direction that would cause pain later? What if the message came not to warn of tragedy but to prevent the slow decline that often goes unnoticed until it's too late? Lives rarely collapse because of sudden disasters, they collapse from small neglects, tiny oversights. Ignored feelings, postponed dreams. And maybe this was the moment that prevented that slow collapse. There was something profoundly humbling about realizing that life cares enough to interrupt your routine. That the universe concerns itself with the details of your choices. That fate is not indifferent but deeply intertwined with your awareness. The message was intense, yes, but maybe intensity was the only thing powerful enough to break the walls built over years, walls of habit, walls of fear, walls of self-neglect. The room felt different now, as if it had shifted into a sacred space without permission, without effort. A soft glow from the streetlight seeped through the curtains, painting faint golden lines across the floor. Each line looked like a path leading somewhere meaningful. And perhaps that was the point. Every moment is a path, but only some moments are invitations, and this moment felt like one. As the night hours deepened further, thoughts became less chaotic, more deliberate. The message began to feel like the beginning of something rather than the interruption of something. It felt like a doorway, one that had appeared suddenly, silently, but undeniably. And though stepping through such a doorway required courage, remaining where you were carried its own risk, the risk of stagnation, the risk of regret, the risk of losing the parts of yourself that deserve to live. Somewhere inside, a new promise formed, a silent, unspoken vow to not ignore the voice within anymore. To not dismiss intuition. To not wait for disaster before choosing clarity. To not allow fear to guide decisions. That promise felt like the real shift, the real message, the real salvation. The warning of tragedy no longer felt like prophecy, it felt like metaphor. The tragedy wasn't something that would fall from the sky, it was something that could grow within if ignored. The tragedy was the life unlived, the dreams unattempted, the truth unspoken, the potential unexplored, an understanding that changed everything. The hours stretched into early morning, and the darkness softened as the first hints of dawn pressed against the horizon. That transition, from night to morning, felt symbolic. It felt like the universe was mirroring the internal shift, showing that even the longest night ends with light. And perhaps the message was simply preparing the soul for its own dawn. The sky slowly brightened, turning from deep blue to pale gray to the softest hint of gold. Birds began their early songs, not loudly but with gentle patterns that felt like a reminder of continuity, of new beginnings, of hope. There was something poetic about how nature awakens without hesitation, without fear, without doubt. And maybe that was the lesson, awaken without resistance. The message, once overwhelming, now felt almost gentle. As if it had accomplished what it came for and no longer needed to shout. It lived quietly in the background of awareness, a reminder, a presence, a guide. By sunrise, a new understanding had formed. Warnings are not punishments. They are gifts. They are moments where the universe bends closer, trying to protect you from the consequences of ignoring your own truth. And the real tragedy is not what might happen externally but what certainly happens internally when you refuse to listen. As sunlight finally spilled through the window, touching everything it met with warmth, the heart felt lighter than it had in months, maybe years. The weight of confusion was gone. The fog had thinned. The path was not fully clear, but it was visible enough to take the next step. And sometimes the next step is all that is needed to change the entire direction of a life. A quiet realization rose. The message was never about fear, it was about alignment. It was never meant to terrify, it was meant to awaken. It was never about losing connection with the divine, it was about returning to it in a deeper, more conscious way. The world looked new when seen through renewed awareness. Even the simple activities of the morning felt sacred. The warmth of water on the hands, the first sip of tea, the first breath of cool air from the open window, everything carried a subtle shimmer of meaning. Because when the mind awakens, the world awakens with it, and despite the intensity of the message, the day felt safe. Not because danger was gone, but because clarity had arrived. And clarity is the strongest protection, the deepest guidance, the most reliable companion. The story wasn't ending. It was only beginning. The story wasn't ending. It was only beginning. As the morning continued to unfold, the air carried a softness that felt deliberate. Almost tender, as if the world itself wanted to make the transition gentle. The mind, still holding traces of the message from the previous day, felt as though it had stepped into a different dimension of awareness. Every sensation felt heightened, every detail slightly more vivid, as if life had been waiting patiently for this exact moment to reveal its next layer. There was a strange sense of being observed, not by people, not by eyes, but by presence. A presence that felt both ancient and immediate. A presence that did not judge but witnessed. That presence was not loud. It was subtle, like the feeling of being guided without being pushed, encouraged without being commanded. It was as if the universe had shifted from whispering warnings to offering quiet companionship. The message still echoed in small waves, "Don't skip me now. I am trying to save your life." But instead of sounding like an ultimatum, it now felt like a reminder of value, your value. Not in a dramatic, world-changing way, but in the quiet realization that your existence mattered more than you allowed yourself to believe. Sometimes the greatest danger is not external tragedy but internal dismissal, dismissing your own worth, your own path, your own voice. As the morning hours passed, a new understanding began weaving itself through the mind. Perhaps the big tragedy was not something physical or catastrophic waiting outside. Perhaps it was the tragedy of living a life disconnected from one's own truth. That kind of tragedy is slow and silent, often unnoticed until a person realizes they've drifted too far from themselves to return easily. The message, then, was not a prophecy, it was an intervention. In that moment of reflection, a question rose softly: what have I been ignoring? It wasn't a guilt-driven question but a curious one, a compassionate one. What emotions had been suppressed? What dreams had been shelved? What warnings had been brushed aside in the rush of daily life? Life is generous with its signs, but humans are skilled at distracting themselves from them. There was now a sense that the message came at the exact second it could be understood, not earlier, not later. The timing was its own form of guidance. Sometimes divine timing does not operate in the comfortable rhythm of human schedules. It arrives when it must, often when you least expect it, because that is when it will finally be heard. Midday approached, and the sun shifted higher, casting sharper shadows along the ground. The world felt more defined, more structured. Clarity had entered the physical space just as it had begun entering the emotional one. The clarity wasn't overwhelming or absolute, it was enough. Enough to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. Enough to sense that today was not just another date on the calendar. Enough to realize that something foundational was being rearranged beneath the surface. And with that realization came a subtle but powerful shift in perspective. Maybe the message wasn't telling you what to fear, maybe it was telling you what to choose. Choose presence over distraction. Choose awareness over avoidance. Choose honesty over comfort. Choose growth over stagnation. Choose yourself over the parts of life that dim your spirit. The moments that followed were marked by small but meaningful changes. The way you looked at your surroundings, the way your mind paused before reacting, the way your heart opened just a bit more, it all felt different. Not dramatically different, but intentionally different. As if you were no longer moving unconsciously through the day. You were paying attention. You were listening, and in that listening, something beautiful began to surface: trust. Not blind trust, not naive trust, but a deeper trust that comes from recognizing that life has been guiding your steps even when you felt lost. The message was not the beginning of fear, it was the beginning of trust. Trust that the universe intervenes. Trust that inner warnings matter. Trust that intuition is not random. Trust that guidance arrives exactly when it's needed. As afternoon light settled across the room, a sense of warmth filled the air. Not physical warmth alone, but emotional warmth. The kind that comes from knowing you're not walking through life alone. The kind that surfaces when you realize that you were never actually abandoned, not by fate, not by God, not by your own inner voice. You had simply drifted too far from the conversation. But now the conversation had resumed. There was still mystery in the message, of course. There were still unanswered questions. But the fear that once surrounded those questions had faded. In its place was curiosity, openness, and a desire to truly understand what the message wanted to reveal. Sometimes, divine communication doesn't give full explanations immediately. It gives what the heart can handle at the moment. It gives nudges instead of maps. It gives direction instead of destination. It gives clarity step by step. As you become ready to receive more, and that, perhaps, was the next lesson, readiness doesn't come from knowing everything. Readiness comes from deciding to listen. The message had done its job. It had shaken the soul awake. It had opened a doorway. It had invited a deeper journey. And the rest of the path would unfold naturally, as all meaningful paths do. One step at a time. The day, still bright and warm, now felt like a continuation of the night's revelation rather than a departure from it. The awareness gained in darkness was now being carried into the light, and with each passing moment, the sense grew stronger. This was not a warning of doom, it was a whisper of destiny.